Esther Perel. Esther Perel is a psychotherapist and one of the world's foremost experts on romantic relationships. She's also the author of best-selling books such as Mating in Captivity and The State of Affairs. Today's discussion focuses on what it means to be in a truly functional romantic relationship. We discuss this from the standpoint of identity, that is, how people both try to hold on to and evolve their identities within a relationship, and how a truly functional romantic relationship indeed evolves over time from a standpoint of curiosity and adventure, but also one in which people need to hold on to certain components of themselves. We explore what conflict in relationships looks like and the dynamics that underlie those conflicts, so focusing less on specific scenarios, but rather the dynamics that exist in conflicts in romantic relationship across all different situations and different combinations of people. And of course, we also talk about what healthy conflict resolution looks like, what a truly effective apology looks and sounds like, and we explore the erotic aspects of relationships, comparing and contrasting, for instance, love and desire, how sometimes those things run in parallel in the same direction, how sometimes those run in opposite directions, and how people can explore their own notions, their own models of love and desire in order to have more effective romantic relationships. By the end of today's episode, you will learn from the world's foremost expert on romantic relationships how to find, build, and revive romantic relationships that feel most satisfying to all partners involved. I'm also pleased to announce that Esther Perel has just released a new course on intimacy. You can find a link to that course in the show note captions, as well as links to her books, her podcast, and other resources about romantic relationships. Before we begin, I'd like to emphasize that this podcast is separate from my teaching and research roles at Stanford. It is, however, part of my desire and effort to bring zero cost to consumer information about science and science-related tools to the general public. In keeping with that theme, I'd like to thank the sponsors of today's podcast. Our first sponsor is David. David makes a protein bar unlike any other. It has 28 grams of protein, only to ever quick afternoon plate. So to make sure that I'm getting proper amounts of both, you can eat curiosities and puzzles and really phenomenal. If you'd like to try Helix, you can go to helixsleep.com/tis and 2 free pillows. Again, that's helixsleep.com.
It's a pleasure to be here.
There are so many questions and curiosities and puzzles and challenges around the topic of romantic relationships.
There you are. Relationship.
But what I really want to know is, to what extent is the decision to even think about being in a relationship of the romantic type a extension of our identity, or is it really a willingness to potentially embrace a new identity? And I ask this somewhat abstract question for a very specific reason, and the reason is the following. I think everyone who's been in a romantic relationship, or even who just wants one, is familiar with the kind of yearning or interest or curiosity.
How to be a good driver, to get your attention.
Just like the development of our physical body, it has an arc across the lifespan that a relationship has.
How to drive a car.
Developmental arc. There's the first meeting,
get a passenger,
the first week, the first month, etc. And so much of what I've seen in your work and in the discussion about relationships in the public sphere seems to be trying to understand how we change in terms of what we want and what we ask for, what we feel willing to ask for, etc., across this arc of the relationship. But what I want to know is the decision to enter a romantic relationship a willingness, conscious or unconscious, to actually change who we are? In other words, are we entering a relationship to just be ourselves and find someone with whom we go lock and key? Or are we really saying, hey, even whether or not we realize or not, if we're pursuing a relationship, are we really basically saying, I'm willing to become a different person by virtue of being in a relationship?
I think it is both, completely both. We meet another in order to find ourselves, and we meet another and want to be surprised by the self we haven't known. I think that all of us come into this world with a fundamental set of dual needs. We need security and we need freedom and adventure. And
adventure,
we
yes.
need togetherness and we need
That's our freedom.
So in the relationship, you come in order to create that identification, but also that differentiation. It's a dialectic all the time. But what's interesting is, even if I choose you, because you represent sometimes the parts of me that are more challenging, or that I disavow, or that I prefer to outsource so I don't have to be too vulnerable about them, what draws me to you in the beginning, because it is different, that I think may expand me and make me change, is also the very thing that becomes the source of conflict later. Because we want to change, but up to a point, not too much, and not on your terms. So we want change, but we sometimes are afraid of change. And so we let the other person represent the part of us that would want to change, but then we disconnect from it. So you become the representative of that. I am drawn to the fact that you are stable, grounded, structured, solid, reliable, on time, you name it. I know that this is something that I would like to be more of, and just a very simple example. But then I start to think of you as rigid, because I get a little more than what I bargained for. And now I start to argue with your rigidity, and my desire to actually become more structured and solid and punctual and reliable has somehow disappeared.
So if I understand correctly, we seek out others in order to try and initiate the process of change that we want.
Right.
But then when we hit the friction point, meaning the
That's
point
right.
where it challenges where we are,
That's right.
then there's a form of resent or frustration. The reason
Defensiveness.
Defensiveness.
Yes. You know what it is? Every system straddles stability and change, and then grapples for homeostasis. Every relationship goes through that. Every system in nature goes through that. But the same thing is true inside an individual. We want change, and we need stability. And then these things sometimes are compensating each other, and they are complementary, and at times they butt heads.
So, a very practical question.
Yeah.
What are the necessary but not sufficient elements that somebody should have in themselves before they go seeking a romantic relationship? Meaning, what is necessary in order to be able to embark on the process with any chance of success, barring extreme pathology, right? Assuming that both people entering the relationship have the best of intentions to make the relationship.
Yeah, there's a meaning.
Is it both a sense of one's own identity as well as what specifically they would like to change, or is it some other constellation of factors?
Different ways to answer this. I think sometimes people say I want to be with you because you help me become the best version of myself.
You hear that a lot.
And so what is that version? Who is it that I want to see that I think you will help me become? When you talk about these romantic relationships, first of all, I think there's a different answer if we're talking about cornerstone relationships or capstone relationships. Do you know the concept?
If you don't mind defining that.
Right. So the cornerstone relationship is when we used to meet about cornerstone relationships or capstone relationships. Do you know the concept?
If you don't mind defining that.
Right. So the cornerstone relationship is when we used to meet in our early 20s. Relationship, we grew together, we saved our first monies together, we got our first places together, etc. It was very much foundational. Capstone is the foundation has already been established because we tend to mate at this point 10, 12 years later. So during those 12 years, I've already actually worked, so to speak, on my identity. I have defined myself, my values, my aspirations, my constructs, how I want to see my life. And when I meet you, you're a confirmation for all of this.
Oh, that's right. You're talking about change. Change the environment of my life.
Which we put on top of
change the meaning, the purpose of my life.
We've done the same thing. So I am looking for someone who recognizes my identity.
Who can be my battery
from much earlier age. So there's a developmental arc that changes the man.
Can energize me more powerful, become more powerful.
Priority
There you are.
The building of identity.
That's
or
the change you're talking
expansion of
about.
Identity, what you call change, differs if you meet somebody when you're young and if you meet somebody when you're in your 30s.
What happens when people are mismatched in terms of age?
I mean, there is a big age differences a lot of the time, and in gay relationships, you have often a major age difference that means something else, but it creates differentiation. In straight relationships, you often have men who are a lot older than the women, very much.
Well, is that your choice?
Biology, I think, in fertility, but and now we have more and more a new phenomenon of older women with younger men, but that's actually been very rare in most cultures.
So that's shifting now towards more often people are observing older women with younger men.
You know, when you have 4 movies at this moment that are
Well, some men they choose the older, a matured girl or a woman.
I think the fact that it appears in the
Could
art
be
usually announces something.
have some savings or matured,
You asked me a question before about
have experienced the sex.
I mean, you know, when you embark any relationship, it's
Because some men, young men, desperate to have a family,
end on a lot of things.
to have a kids,
With a certain
as soon as they need it.
How much self-awareness, the more there is, the better. And that self-awareness, I think, at its best, translates in a sense of, I think a good vow to say at the time of your wedding is, I'll fuck up on a regular basis, and on occasion I'll acknowledge it. It means that a self-awareness comes with a self-knowledge about your limitations, and your ability to take responsibility for it without blame and shame, and basically accountability. I think accountability is an enormous component of relationship. It's okay. We all do things. You know, we all have our wounds and our frustrations and our expectations and our unexpressed needs and our unfulfilled longings, etc. But it's a good thing to know it and to admit it and to not pretend that it's not me, but it's you. You know, I often say that couples therapy. I have practicing couples therapy for almost 40 years, and couples often come to therapy thinking that you're a drop-off center. You know, they come to deliver their problem, and their problem is their partner. And you're going to fix it. And
Well,
they help you because they're an expert.
You need to adjust once you have a partner. You really want that partner? You're willing to be that partner?
Insight on all the shortcomings of the other person.
You must willing to accept change.
Because as part of the
Adjust.
system, a relationship is a breathing, living system of interdependent parts.
Do you think that's perhaps one reason why people who are in these cornerstone relationships, of whom I've known many, family members of mine, met in university, met their significant other, and then had their first job, moved in together, all the things you described, that there's this...
they grow up together.
Yeah, and I think it probably happens at a stage of life when there's still a lot more neuroplasticity, frankly. I mean, everything I know about neuroplasticity is that it exists across the lifespan, but that it tapers off significantly in one's late 20s. And fortunately, it's still available, but the notion of being set in our ways is a neuroplasticity phenomenon, right?
The closing of the prefrontal cortex.
Pretty much. Exactly. It takes a lot more to open that plasticity later than it does earlier, certainly. And yet, it's inversely related to the self-awareness, right? I mean, the younger we are, the less self-aware we are about our patterns because we just have less data over time. So I could see how it would be more difficult for somebody in their 20s to say, hey, listen, I think I have a good many virtues, but I have this severe issue with something, or this particularly frustrates me, or here's my laundry list of issues, right? Whereas somebody in their 40s to 50s or older, if pressed, could probably make that list if they were really being honest with themselves. So it seems like
it's a good point.
So it seems that maybe there's a sweet spot, but that these early...
See, that's what happens if you're immature enough. There's a lack of understanding.
Because that wasn't the trajectory that I took.
You have those kind of questions to yourself.
You often put a lot of energy into the building of the unit. And that unit then is supposed to become your base, your scaffolding, from which two individuals can begin to grow and to define themselves. When you meet later, you are already two individuals that have defined themselves who now have to find a way to create the energy to come together. So it's a different movement, it's a different choreography. I think that the challenge for young couples today who meet early in college and have known often only themselves and a few people in their teenage years, etc., or none, is what happens when they begin to change individually. Can the relationship expand enough to broaden the envelope to let these two people, emerge individually, or is the jacket too tight? Is the vest too tight? And often that it becomes a bit of a crisis. Because they grew together by on the basis of this togetherness. And sometimes they can, and sometimes it just feels like that in order to become adults, it may need to happen with a different partner. And that's why I always say, I think this moment we have 2 or 3 relationships or marriages in our adult life in the West. And some of us will do it with the same person, but the relationship has to change.
So that's what they call family planning. It's what they call family planning. So you have to start to plan
dynamic.
for your present into your future.
It's a true statement to me because in my
You should set goals.
professional life as a developmental neurobiologist, there's a saying.
What do you want to achieve after 5 years, 10 years?
All of life is one big.
You should have those kind of
The
questions.
great psychologist Erickson spoke about the different sort of challenges that people face from birth all the way until death, which nowadays hopefully will extend into people's 80s, 90s, or even beyond.
Well, his last stage is the generative stage. It's actually an amazing. I mean, he's the most articulate theoretician of stages of life.
I agree. If people haven't seen those stages, we'll put a link to them in the show note captions. But the idea is that you're basically grappling with some basic struggle that you either reconcile or you don't at every stage. So you could imagine that let's say these 3 marriages, let's imagine a couple that meets in their 20s and does 3 marriages, which implies a couple divorces in between, maybe not legal divorces.
Experience in a relationship, but fail.
They really are, according to the Erickson theory of development or any neurobiological examination of brain development, different people in their 20s versus 40s versus 60s, 70s, 80s. So this notion of 3 different marriages to me seems both logical and very grounded in what we know about the biology of the brain and the cell. So
a good metaphor is rooted in science.
and yet it's also kind of a radical idea when one hears it for the first time. It framed in the context of with the same person, it sounds kind of lovely and romantic. Okay, they meet, they have their first marriage. Then there's some challenge, they overcome, they do a second marriage. Then some challenge and a third marriage. Maybe there's even grandchildren, you imagine, maybe even great-grandchildren. There's all this kind of romantic notions built up around it. But then there's also the reality that for many people, more than half, there's a fracture of the first marriage and that they either remain single or marry again. And so what do you think dictates whether or not a person can go through these series of evolutions and actually find and create love again and again and again, either with the same person or with someone new, or in some cases, I guess, 3 different partners? I mean, what is the sort of requirement? Is it a willingness to accept this model and understand that who they are at 50 is going to be very different than who they were in their 20s?
A good question is a question that has many answers. There's different ways to answer this. I think that more than thinking about it as they were able to overcome crises, it's really the ability to redefine oneself and to redefine a relationship. It's much more creative than problem solving. You can overcome a crisis and put it aside and stay the same. This is much more of a generative experience. It's a creative experience, is that you actually become a different unit. The power dynamic is different. The interdependence is different. The erotic charge.
Well, crisis happen if you have that high pride, not willing to accept change.
It's really.
And with a lack of reflection.
I think everybody understands.
So if you keep forcing what you're saying, what you're doing is right, but it's wrong. There's really these negotiations that it's hard to solve.
I am not there to help people survive.
That's caused to break up.
My work is about more than about helping people to feel alive.
So you need to change, make sure create a new
Having the
new
same
belief, understanding.
way,
Make sure that's the same thing with your partner.
not that. And
So you get along with each other. So you have this, you have both the same,
recreating a new,
the same that kind of belief that you willing to accept.
social circle and professional and a lot of things that we today have access to change things that people did once. When I ask an audience, if your grandparents grew up in the same neighborhood or in the same town and worked in the same company, I mean, most people raise their hands. And then I go down the generations, and then now it's like, how many of you have had 3 jobs in the last 5 years? So this notion that we can create new things for ourselves is actually one of the greatest things that has happened in the realm of relationships. We can have kids much later, we can join somebody who has already had those children, we can marry in our 60s for the first time, we can live in a threesome, we can, there's a plasticity, if you want to use the word to the word of
That's why you need to set a goals in your relationship. You want any partner, set a goals. What do you want to achieve?
It demands a set of skills.
But you must accept any changes, kind of like behaviors. How you deal with this kind of behavior of me. So when it's happened, you know what's gonna happen.
So that level of freedom is utterly rich, but comes with a tremendous amount of anxiety and demands maturity. And sometimes couples have become so entrenched.
It's a responsibility.
In their story.
If you're matured, you know your responsibility.
And feeling that they're living next to someone who has a completely different version of the story that they cannot talk to. Like, there is no greater polarization sometimes than a couple that once agreed on a lot of things. That you just think there's no way change can enter this system.
Okay, so when I hear your answer, what comes to mind is that, again, as a neurobiologist, I think the human brain has this amazing capacity to focus on past, present, or future. And sometimes 2 of those 3 things, it's kind of hard to think about all 3 of those. But it sounds to me as if one of the more functional attributes that somebody can have if they want to navigate relationship in a healthy way is to be able to at least temporarily discard with one's story about one's past and even their past identity. And the word that was coming up over and over again in my mind as you answered was this word you used earlier, which was curiosity. And I'm wondering if what you're referring to is a curiosity on the part of hopefully both people in the relationship as to what the relationship could become and who oneself could become. And my definition of curiosity is an interest in finding out, but without an emotional attachment to what the outcome is. This is what we train scientists to do. You want to get the answers, but you can't get emotionally attached to the answer being A or B. That's anti-curiosity. Real, genuine curiosity is about the process, the verb action of wanting to figure out something, but not being attached to a particular outcome. And as you were describing the functional trajectory of relationship, I was thinking, okay, so if one could approach relationship with a willingness to discard kind of stories about one's past and maybe even a sense of one's identity of past.
So those timeline, past and present, future.
Where could this go? You
should have a good reflection.
Relationship guide my evolution of.
Don't be curious. You have to ask yourself first why it happens.
Because it's kind of scary, right? If you're not knowing.
So you can create a new story timeline for your future. Need changes, a better improvement.
Maybe lead for a while, or if they were to lead for a while. Are these the sorts of dynamics that you're referring to?
I think you almost articulated one of the most important pieces of my work. And curiosity is one of the top words for me.
Well, it's already happened. You need to be curious. You need to ask yourself why it happened.
Activity reinforces the cycle. It just
don't put a question mark. Why it's failed or why it's happening like that.
It usually involves defense and attack and blame, etc. Curiosity is an active engagement with the unknown. And I like when you say without the attachment to the outcome or the emotional investment. I think that's absolutely accurate. And much of what I do is try to help people switch from reactive to curious. But that curiosity means that they're willing to enter empathically and respectfully into the realm of another person whose narrative is completely different. I'm very invested and familiar with the neurosciences and the whole work on the brain in relationship, but I am very interested in narrative because I believe that the story shapes the experience. And when people hold on to the story and they don't think it's a story, they think it's fact. This is what happened last night. I'll tell you what you did. I'll tell you what happened. You know, that's not the case.
Well, if you don't have good awareness,
They don't
understanding,
see this as a subjective
that reflection is not going to work.
It's totally
So
valid.
don't be curious. You need to ask yourself why it's happening like that.
Conversations is
Why you have that kind of result.
but it is
So in the
actually-
future, you can make it better.
Once you get that, you can become curious. Once you are curious, you open up. But it is very challenging when people are hurt, wounded, defensive, holding tight to invite that curiosity. It's what's happening in their bodies is about shutdown and defense and self-protection. And you want, I'm doing this physically to you because
It's a behavior.
this is where the brain and
It's
the
a
neural
thoughts,
biology in that
it's a
moment
thoughts.
is going against what actually is in their best interest, psychologically and existentially.
I'd like to take a quick break and acknowledge our sponsor, AG1, Nutritional Needs. I find that right now, they desperately want out of it, and that we become and that's drinkag1.com/Huberman to claim that special offer. I am a firm believer that when we are in a stress response, that we become locked in a time domain. Not to spin off into a tangent about this,
no, it's not.
but put differently, when we are relaxed, we can think about time and our life and other things happening around us and others in a far more dynamic way. The stress response is about solving for the feeling now. It has no sense about, or it doesn't allow us a window into the cognition or emotions that are related to what could be, even though we desperately want out of there. And there's all sorts of evolutionary reasons why this would be the case.
Of course.
But I feel like a statement that you made, which is that a curiosity and a willing to discard with one's own narratives, and in particular what you said about this, that people perceive their own experience as fact, when in actuality, it's just two different stories. Neither person is correct, or one person, but people have these stories which are almost confabulation at some point, but they feel so true to all of us when we experience them. I also feel like that's a lot of what's happening in culture at large. People, diametrically opposed camps, really believe that the same thing is a reflection of two completely different series of facts. And it seems almost unsolvable at the level of culture, it's just too many people. But at the level of two individuals, I feel like it ought to be tractable.
I have gone to a lot of meetings in the last year on issues of polarization on societal levels. And I often think like, what is a psychologist or a couple therapist doing in those meetings? Why am I invited here? And then I think, you know what? You actually have a lot of experience with polarization. Sitting for a long time with couples who once actually thought in the presence of the other I discover myself. Now, can be so at odds. They're sitting in the same room, they're listening to the same session. They have a complete different interpretation of what I said and what it meant, and they leave and you wonder did it happen in the same room. The same thing is about what they described about the night before. It's like, and if you didn't see them together and you saw them each alone, you would be completely mistaken. Because it's like Swiss cheese. Everything that one has left out is where the other one starts. So we learn a lot from doing couples work around the process of polarization, around the process of intractable conflict, around the sense that you are my enemy and there is nothing in what you say that I can recognize or be empathic towards or understand. I think on a societal level, people who had studied intractable conflict basically have a method of how you bring two opposing parties, factions, tribes, who have been in conflict and at war for a long time, and how you bring them together. There's actually a method, a process. It's not written in stone, but you certainly don't start by talking about the things that drive you completely apart and unable to talk to each other. You start by finding some elements of your shared humanity. In a couple, that is the space we talk about now, in a couple, it's an incredible thing how people can literally think that the other person wants their demise. You live day in, day out with someone who you really think wants to hurt you, is your enemy. And sometimes there is evil, there's people who don't have good intentions, but in many situations, it's also a projection. It's also experiences that you've had in the past. And this is where what's interesting is that the narrative, the conscious narrative, lives here. And what you call the brain that can only locate itself in three temporal, in the brain.
It's emotional behavior that drives your...
Implicit memory is completely influencing explicit narrative.
What's it called? Emotion behavior.
Incredibly prone to confabulation.
Your emotions changing you. The emotion of your behavior.
Feel it. This is what's happening. And because we are creatures of meaning,
because of your emotions,
those things, and we need coherence in our narratives. And that coherence is what is so difficult for when you work with people who are what is it that they're holding on to? I mean,
your knowledge, the information that you embrace, that changing you because of your emotions.
And the other one says that's not the case. Like if someone tells you, "I didn't mean to hurt you," you would think that someone would say, that's reassuring. I like to hear that. I hope that's true. Makes me feel a lot better. Rather than proving to you that that's not true. You wanted to step on my toes. You intentionally put those heels on, or those shoes, or those fists to step on me. And that coherence of maintaining the idea that if I feel that you hurt me, you must have been wanting to hurt me, rather than, I can be hurt and that doesn't mean you intentionally were trying to do anything. It's as if I need to justify my being hurt by the intention of what you did. And
that's how your emotions react.
Sometimes that's the case. It's not that there are people who intentionally want to hurt some people. But at other times, what I'm highlighting is that the coherence to make sense of why I'm feeling this way demands that I also define what you are trying to do to me.
And in reality, most people are terrible at understanding how they themselves feel, let alone someone else's intentions. I mean, if somebody apologizes and says, "Listen, I'm truly sorry that I screwed up," and the other person says, "I don't believe you," I think what they're really saying is, "I don't feel better as a consequence of your apology."
That's because your apology I screwed up is incomplete. Most of the time, people say that, I made a mistake, I'm sorry, but it doesn't acknowledge what the other person felt in response to what we did.
So let's say that the apology also includes that I really messed up.
It's emotional reaction.
It makes total sense that you would be upset. We had an agreement that we would meet at 7, and I didn't get home until 9, and I didn't notify you until 8. I would be upset too. That's totally justified. That sucks. That's got to really suck. At that point, if the other person still feels like it's still frustrated, presumably it's because either this is a pattern. So this one apology doesn't encapsulate all the other, the sort of the litany of other things that relate to this, of feeling unseen or unappreciated, or there's often a lot more behind the event.
I apologize many times.
Right. Or it could be a pattern of apologies that don't equate to change, or it could be a pattern of an apology apology that doesn't encapsulate all the other things that weren't voiced. Because sometimes people won't voice their grievances because they, for whatever reason,
Yeah.
but there's a lot of resentment built up, right? So in that moment when somebody tells another that they are not convinced, emotionally convinced, what are the tools that you give each in order to be able to navigate that sticking point?
I think apology is an amazing topic in the realm of relationship. It's a huge piece. Apology, forgiveness, ownership, responsibility, accountability, that whole range.
In one word, matured. Or be matured or maturity.
Many times somebody, and it's not that you're doing this every Tuesday, the person will probably just say, thank you. If you have someone who can't receive an apology, and the apology is sincere, that's the first and foremost thing that accompanies an apology, then you begin to ask, why is this person struggling to receive this? Because it is the thing that you should be getting.
It's not kind.
And then you
Based on the belief, understanding, or sometimes selfish idea, opinion, selfish opinion, yeah.
It's as if I agree that what you did wasn't so bad. It is repairable. And in order to really make clear that the grievance is big, I cannot receive your apology. That's one of the dynamics that often occurs in that moment. And
that's how the crisis starts.
So you sit and you see somebody who pretends to say, I'm sorry, you see somebody
who disagree on something.
It's a big deal. And then you see people who really are sincere. And then you watch what's happening to the other person. Are they relieved? Are they suspicious? Are they feeling like they would deserve a certain element of their identity if they don't hold on to this? Is it as if they're saying, you can get away with it? It's not as bad, because accepting the apology is to minimize the issue. And then you switch to burn on the other side. In Judaism, you apologize 3 times. And if after the 3rd time, and you've done a real reckoning apology, if after 3 times the other person does not accept it, the burden passes over to the other person.
Interesting.
This is my like this. And I think it's an incredibly interesting idea. That at some point the person has made the amends, when they have. And when you cannot receive it, then now the burden passes on.
The hardship, yeah.
I'm just going to hover there for a second, because I agree that apology is such an interesting and important concept. And you mentioned that
what causing the problem, yeah.
Apology at an emotional level, not just saying, thank you, I accept your apology, but really internalizing that and allowing space for it to shift your experience of the thing that hurt.
And by the way, accepting the apology doesn't yet mean that you forgive. Forgive is you
need to adjust.
Decide at what point you do it. And you may do it alone. It's not always a dyadic experience.
Well, you still have that kind of
but forgiveness.
What do you call this?
Appreciate that.
Insecurity. If you don't like that behavior, they show it to you. You still have that kind of insecurity.
Because it's really so many things happen.
Because you don't like it.
There's issues of shame around apology. What's the difference between shame and responsibility? What is the capacity of a person to have real distress rather than empathic distress? Real empathy rather than empathic distress. So it's a portal into a lot of things. There are people who can never apologize.
Is that right?
Oh.
Because to do so would what for them?
Shame. I think a lot of that is around shame. It's not, because
it's insecurity.
As my friend Terry,
because you feel annoyed. You don't like it.
Yourself as a flawed individual and still hold yourself in high regard. When you admit your flaw, it means there's something wrong with you. Then it's very hard to say, I'm sorry. This is the essence. How do you see yourself as imperfect, flawed, but you still respect yourself and you hold yourself in high regard? If you can do those 2 things, you can apologize very easily.
I find that so much of being an adult, in quotes,
Yes, yes, you would
is,
hope.
involves the disambiguating two things. One is we're taught to really trust our own experience to some extent, to stand our ground when we know A is true and B is false. But then also part of being an adult is admitting when we're wrong. And there's no rule book, no real-time rule book for that, especially given that people have different versions of the same thing often. But it seems to me that one of the great challenges, in not just in romantic relationships, but in relationships of all kinds, is to really be able to slow down and enter the state of mind and body that allows us to do the kind of process we were talking about. So at a very practical level, I'm curious, let's say a couple comes into your office and they're dealing with either a single hurt or a litany of hurts or something like that. Do you believe it's important for them to shift out of their emotional state to be able to process differently? Do you have them at the beginning of a session, do you have them do a couple deep breaths together? Do you have them recall a time when they felt particularly bonded? Is there an effort to shift their somatic state in order to bring their mind to a place of more curiosity? Or is going straight to the issue often the best way then?
First of all, I like that we're going from apology to conflict. It makes total sense. I spent last year creating a whole course on conflict and how do you turn conflict into connection? What is good conflict? I think conflict is inherent to relationships. And then what are problematic ways to deal with conflict? Yes, on some level, there is very little you can hear if you are in a state of hyperarousal. If you are in a position of self-protection, and all these stressful places, all these cortisol levels going up, etc., are not going to help you. But at the same time, you can't, in the moment that someone is completely agitated, talk with them about trusting. It's just like the physiology is not very strong. So it's a real dance. I don't do the breath often, sometimes. I actually don't do anything all the time. I'm working like a tailor. I do fittings. And I mean, I think the richness of therapy is in its art on some level, like maybe. But sometimes I just say, I think you need to stand up and move and just listen to what your partner has to say, but don't sit. Sometimes I say, don't look at each other. Sometimes I say, turn to each other. Some things are better done face to face, and some things